So I'm delighted to be joined by Will Tanner, who is the director of Onward. That's a right-leaning think tank, former advisor to Theresa May. So obviously recently you published a new report called The Politics of Belonging. I thought that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah.
And its fundamental argument was that most British voters, when given the choice, will prioritise security over freedom. Do you think the current government gets that?
I do actually, and I've been quite kind of heartened by some of the early signals from a Johnson premiership, in the sense that I think Boris has clearly identified that the British public are no longer interested to the same degree that they previously were in kind of questions of freedom, individualism, autonomy, and actually much more interested in questions of belonging and community and security, as you say. So if you look at some of the early things that he's done, it's investment in the police, investment in schools, investment in prisons, and regional investment too in things like the High Speed North, in order to, I think, give back a bit of a sense of belonging to different places.
Yeah. I mean, do you think to some extent it explains part of the popularity of Corbynism? So, I mean, the emphasis on economic security, so issues like rent controls, the nationalisation of certain utilities, higher taxes, for even if we may not particularly like them, that's kind of where their appeal comes from.
I think that's absolutely right, and there is absolutely no doubt that those policies are popular in a very simplistic, populist way. Actually, they have widespread resonance in a world where people see rents rising, they see kind of nationalised industries perhaps not delivering as good a service as they possibly could for consumers. They see kind of the railways not running on time. It's a very easy play for Corbynism, and actually, if I think back to the 2017 general election, where I was kind of involved, actually one of the things that Corbyn did very well was kind of weaponise security in an economic sense.
I mean, conversely, on kind of more social issues, do you think the Conservatives have an advantage in terms of security? So, I mean, law and order, terrorism being the two obvious ones. So when Priti Patel says that criminals should, feel terror, there's certain elements of the commentariat gets up in arms, but then there's polling that shows that's what the public think. Do you think the Conservatives can make more of that?
I do, and I think that clearly law and order is an issue that's rocketed up the political agenda. It's increasingly in our focus groups, we find it increasingly brought up by individual members of the public, and it's a major talking point, I think, outside Westminster and in lots of towns and villages and cities. But the clear point for me would be to focus on law and order, but without descending into authoritarianism. And that's the line that actually Conservatives need to tread quite carefully, because I think there is a danger of being a bit too populist on law and order and actually not really making very much progress on the actual issue, but making a load of kind of nice sounding soundbites.
Now, a lot of what you're saying sounds quite similar to your former Theresa May advisor, to what Theresa May was saying when she first came Prime Minister in 2017, kind of her original speech outside Downing Street. Do you think that Theresa May would have delivered more on this agenda had it not been for the Brexit distraction?
I think she would have done, and I think there's absolutely no doubt that Brexit sucked a lot of oxygen out of that government and took up a huge amount of bandwidth in her administration, and she herself would admit that. I mean, I think the point that I would say is that actually this agenda has been bubbling under the surface while politicians have largely focused on Brexit for the past 2-3 years, but possibly much longer actually. You could argue that actually lots of Cameronism, the early big society pledges, were trying to get a little bit of this agenda but didn't really uncover it properly. Yeah. And we're now in a situation where voters are quite clearly asking for something different from the kind of liberalism that they've had for the last 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And I think politicians are starting to get that. So it does feel like we're at an inflection point, but it will require politicians to grasp a different type of doing politics.
Yeah. I was just saying, I'll keep off Brexit off. I'll do one sort of Brexit-related question. So obviously there are some in the Conservative Party who want to take Britain in, I guess what you might call a more libertarian direction. They come to Singapore on Thames. I mean, presumably, in your view, that would be deeply unpopular with the public, and it's not the direction the Conservative Party should be going in.
I think that's broadly true. We don't find a huge amount of support at all for a kind of low tax, low spend economy. If you look at the British Social Attitude Survey, it shows pretty clearly people want more spending and actually are willing to put up with a bit more taxation in order to sustain that, and we found that in our polling too. I think the reality is people want a bit more public investment. They want investment in public services. They want their schools, their NHS, their prisons, their police to be funded properly, and they see a bit of a breakdown in their communities, and that points to me towards a more community-based agenda rather than one around individualism.
Yeah. Now, another of the findings of your report was that there's been a big breakdown in traditional class loyalties in terms of voting, not traditional voting loyalties, which I think you ascribe to Brexit. I mean, to what extent do you think that's class-based? And do you think that gives the Conservative Party an opportunity to perhaps to take some working class voters who are kind of concerned about security issues?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, we have much higher levels of political volatility in people's voting pattern than we have done probably at any point in the post-war period. And people are much less attached to traditional parties. And that's true on left and right. This isn't a kind of associated with one particular party or with Leave or Remain as happening across the spectrum. Now, I think Brexit is part of that, but it would be wrong to suggest it's the entire picture. It's clearly down to changing economic reality, globalisation, automation, immigration to some degree, changing social reality, people living in very different communities now to the ways in which they did 20, 30 years ago. So I think there has been a big breakdown. The key thing is what political parties do about it. I personally see a huge opportunity for the Conservative Party to reach into parts of Britain and parts of the population that they've never really had any business being, and representing working class or lower middle class voters, the kind of core middle England, in a way that is actually very different to perhaps the Conservative Party of 20, 30 years ago.
I mean, do you think to some extent that's already started to happen? So I mean, I was looking at some of the polling figures for the 2017 general election, and it was kind of the first general election in which proportionally the typical working class vote was pretty much evenly split Tory-Labour. I mean, there was no huge disparity like there traditionally is. I mean, do you think that's already starting? Is it we're going to see a lot more of that?
We will see more of that, and that's partly a reflection, as you say, of the existing voting base. So we've seen a huge restructuring of the electorate since 2016 in particular, and 2017 was the first election where the Conservative Party was had the largest share of working class voters. It was also, as we've shown in our work, is the party of apprentices now, whereas Labour is very much the party of graduates, and Labour is also the party of cities, and the Conservatives are increasingly taking their heartlands from kind of Middle England rather than from metropolitan constituents. And so I think actually to a large degree this is already happening, but that will self-reinforce over time, and the Conservative Party will increasingly have a new base, whereas Labour will have a base largely liberal graduates in cities.
I mean, do you think it's fair to say that Labour's abandoned its traditional working class base?
I think in some respects the Labour Party today is very, very different from the Labour Party of Clement Attlee or Aneurin Bevan or some of the Keir Hardie, some of the kind of historic leaders of the Labour Party. It is much more liberal, I think, than it has been in a long time, and the leadership is much more associated with the concerns of kind of metropolitan Britain versus the rest. Now, inevitably, that entails a bit of a juncture between the working class base of kind of northern working class mining towns versus London boroughs.
I mean, another thing I found very interesting about your report was some of the stuff about kind of attitudes to liberal democracy. I mean, some of it I found quite concerning. So it was particularly amongst, what surprised me actually, particularly amongst some of the younger age cohorts, there was higher support you'd expect for military rule than there are amongst the older generations. I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think some of the young are losing faith in liberal democracy?
So we were as startled as you were by some of those findings, although actually if you look at the international data, it shouldn't be as surprising because we see the same thing happening in Western Europe and in the United States. It's a fascinating question why that's happening. It's definitely happening to a large degree. 36% of under 35s supporting the idea of military rule, 26% thinking democracy is a bad idea or a bad way to run the country. I think partly it's a cohort effect, so younger people bluntly haven't had experience of authoritarianism in their daily lives, and older generations have had direct experience either here or abroad of that and are much more live to some of the consequences. But I think it also stems to some extent from a rejection of our politics at the moment, and the kind of declining trust in political parties seems to be feeding through to some degree into how people view liberal democracy as a whole. People are much less trusting of politicians, they're much less trusting of parties, and they're perhaps therefore much less trusting of Parliament as a whole.
I mean, the other thing that really interested me from that was that the region which is most sympathetic to military rule, by quite a margin, is London. I think it's about 3 times as sympathetic as the next 2 regions, which are North East, North West. I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think there's kind of like a myth of liberal London which we haven't quite properly understood?
So I personally put that down entirely to demographics. So the fact that London has a much higher degree of young people and a much higher degree of BME voters as well, who are also slightly more leaning towards authoritarianism. So it will be a demographic effect from London's population. But I think it does give the lie to some degree of the idea of London being entirely liberal. I mean, it is more liberal on social issues, perhaps on some economic issues, but not when it comes to politics, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, with a new government, if Boris managed to do anything other than Brexit, kind of what would your policy priorities be?
So I think there is a clear agenda for a party to kind of correct some of the imbalances that have happened in our economy, our society and our politics over quite a long period of time. So if you look at, for example, the growth of university education and the fact that 50% of people don't go to university, increasingly let down by the technical education system, I think there's a set of priorities there that a government could embrace. There's something quite powerful about trying to, Boris has used the phrase level up, which I think is exactly the right phrase, of levelling up Britain's regions, so that they are performing perhaps not at the same economic level of London, but at a much higher level than they are now, and that the gap between London and the rest is much smaller. And similarly with our politics, I think there is a case for a much more devolved, decentralised and kind of locally based politics that allows local people to take much greater control of what's happening in their local community and their local public services in their local environment. So a rebalanced agenda which is about helping those who felt left behind, forgotten, neglected in the last few decades.
Okay. And obviously that's very much what rhetorically Boris is saying. I mean, do you think these policy proposals can achieve that?
So I think in order to achieve it, he will need to be very bold. This can't be just a continuation of the policies of David Cameron or even the policies that I was pursuing under Theresa May. We need to go much further. That means actually changing the investment rules for how government decides where it spends public money on R&D, transport, housing, some of the big economic levers that it has at its disposal. It means, for example, actually spending much more money on technical education rather than just saying that we're going to, and being willing perhaps to rebalance actively away from higher education investment towards technical, for example. And it means doing some of the things that he's already doing in terms of spending money on schools, hospitals, the police and prisons, where clearly there's a public demand for some greater investment.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. I mean, kind of going back to the stuff about faith in liberal democracy.
Yeah.
So obviously, you could argue there's authoritarian tendencies rising in various different parts of the world. I mean, do you think there's a growing ideologically coherent threat or challenge to liberal democracy in the same way that it was during the Cold War? And do you think the rising power of China has something to do with that?
That's a very good question. I don't think it's entirely down to the rise of China, but it's clear that China is developing a new model for its economy and its politics, which does in some way contradict that Francis Fukuyama phrase that liberal democracy is the end of history. They are developing an entirely different model of the economy that does kind of threaten the West's view of kind of liberal market development and liberal democracy. But I think actually what's happening in liberal democracies around the world is to a large degree because of the failures of liberal governments to understand the negative impact of liberal policies and to ensure that the distribution of the gains from liberal economics and liberal democracy are shared throughout the population rather than just by a relatively small chunk of society. And if we're going to actually save liberal democracy and save market economies, we need to be much bolder in understanding that threat and mitigating those negative consequences, because we can't just have a situation where some people benefit from the system and the vast majority of people don't.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much,
a lot.
James. Cheers.